Hello, and thank you for joining us. Today, we will be speaking with Professor Radha D'Souza. Radha is a thinker, author, lawyer, and activist. Presently, she is a professor of international law, development, and conflict studies at the University of Westminster in the UK. Prior to this, she has taught at a number of other universities and worked as a practicing lawyer in India. She is the author of numerous books, including What's Wrong with Rights, Social Movements, Law, and Liberal Imaginations, and Interstate Disputes over Krishna Waters, Law, Science, and Imperialism. She has long been active in political campaigns and social movements both in India and globally, and presently sits on the steering committee for the Campaign Against Criminalizing Communities, or CAMPAC. She has also been a longtime friend of the Kurdish movement, having participated in the International Peace Delegation to Imrali and written the preface for the English translation of the second volume of Öcalan's Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization. Radha, thank you very much for joining us.
My pleasure, Connor. It's great to be part of this interview series that you're doing. Thank you very much for asking me to be part of it.
Thank you. The pleasure is mine. First, I wanted to ask you a bit more about your background, specifically your work in India, how you came to academia, your continued involvement with social movements throughout this whole period, and how you came to meet the Kurdish movement.
Okay, that's a lot of questions.
Yeah, that's true.
Clubbed into one. I will begin with India first, which is where my life is and has been, and I think will continue to be, even though I live in the UK and teach in the UK. I guess I became sensitized, if you like, to everything that was happening in India in the 70s when I was actually in school. And I come from a Tamil family, but my parents moved to Maharashtra, which is another state. And Maharashtra was one of the first states to give birth, if you like, to a very far-right Hindutva type fundamentalist movement. And this was a state organization called the Shiv Sena. And the Shiv Sena targeted Tamils. That's where the whole fundamentalism begins. And we as a Tamil family, I mean, parents, for example, they were extremely insecure and very naturally very concerned about our safety, how we dressed. For example, my father, who was always very proud of Tamil culture and insisted we dressed like Tamils, suddenly withdrew from that policy and didn't want anyone in his family dressing like Tamils because he was afraid that we might be attacked. So I think that was growing up in school as a schoolgirl. This was had a formative impression on me. And then, of course, as we grew up and student movements, India had a very, very powerful youth movement at that time, because I think our generation of young people, we were disillusioned with the promises of independence. Because independence promised, like for my parents' generation, my grandparents' generation, that was their formative, definitive experience. And we kind of started questioning, is this really what you fought for? That was our question to our parents. And like many other people of my generation, we were part of a youth national awakening, a reawakening, if you like. And when I joined the university, I became, as an undergraduate student, involved in organization that was called Progressive Youth Movement and Proyom and so on. So that was kind of the thing. And then came the national emergency. Indira Gandhi declared emergency. And then, before then, and then we felt we had to do something for the country. And I, being somebody who lived in Bombay, where trade unions were very strong and powerful, I became involved in the trade union movement and started working with the Maharashtra union, trade union called Sarva Shramik Sangh. So that's how we became, involved in activism and things. And then came the emergency when Indira Gandhi declared emergency, suspended the constitution, and bingo, everything we thought took for granted was gone, literally overnight, and we were not allowed to speak, which is, saying something. And that is the time when I thought, when many of us were kind of thinking about, that's when I studied law, because all the political activities, trade unions, everything was kind of, on the margins. And I decided to study law. And part of that thinking was we didn't have our own lawyers. Movements, social movements did not have their own lawyers. And we were dependent on, the legal profession to defend us and our people. And that didn't always work out, both economically, politically, and so many other ways. And there was a feeling that we should have our own lawyers. That is, the movements should have their own lawyers. And that's when, during the emergency, I studied law, believing. And also there was a sense that, who knows, India might become like another one of those tin pot dictatorships that were everywhere around the third world at that time. And so it was like bracing up, because if nothing else, you could use, as a lawyer, you could defend people. So this was kind of a very minimalist, if you like, aspiration. But luckily for us, the emergency was lifted in 77, just when I'd finished my law, degree. And so I started practicing and defending unions and so on. And civil liberties became, there was an eruption of civil liberties movements around the country at that time. Because after independence, there was this feeling that, oh, we didn't need civil liberties, because after all, the British were gone and we had a fantastic constitution. So who needs civil liberties, kind of thing. But the emergency then reinforce the fact that, yes, you always need civil liberties and you always need democratic rights. So that's when the legal practice then kind of became a combination of public interest litigation, civil liberties, democratic rights type of issues, as well as my old, home, the trade union movement. So that was kind of the thing. But along the way, I think there was the legal practice and the faith in legality. It didn't make any sense. I mean, there were times when I would be saying one thing in court and coming out and saying something completely different at an activist meeting. In the activist meetings, we would be talking about, foreign capital, multinationals invading India, doing away with our rights, all of that. And then when I went to court, I would be arguing that, yes, the multinational companies had the best labor standards. And I would be presented with that. And there was no, escaping that reality. So, things didn't make sense. And so I thought that I should probably, and of course, the far right was increasing in my state, although nationally also, but much more in my state. So in the 1996 state elections, for example, Shiv Sena won a thumping majority, swept the legislative assembly in the state. And many of them were trade unionists, people we have worked with very closely. If you looked at the profile of the assembly, the state assembly, which is a state parliament, if you like, a large majority of them were from the trade union movement. And we were kind of thinking, what is going on here? So that was my thing. And that is when I started questioning, what we as social movements were doing. And it seemed to me that we did the economic struggles very well, whether it's trade unions, farmers, agriculture, all of those things. We did the political struggles very well. We could still hold up a big fight. But when it came to the philosophical struggles, the ideological struggles, I felt that we were really lagging behind. All sorts of things were happening in the West, in many other places, and we were not even responding to them. We were not even answering them. For example, the so-called cultural turn, the so-called postmodernism, and the post-colonialism, and all the posting began. We were not even responding to them, let alone engaging and developing our own theoretical things. And law was not making sense. And that's when I decided to quit legal practice and go as far away as possible. And, and I read geography actually, because the whole thing was I walked away from law completely and did my PhD in geography. And I was in the natural geography department, so it was an interesting, so all the scientific, oceanographers and environmentalists and all of them. And that's when I, came to the academia. So have I left out anything in your long list of things that you wanted me to talk about?
Finally, I
Uh,
suppose coming to the Kurdish movement.
Kurdish movement, yeah.
Yes.
Well, I moved to the UK because I got a job here. There was no other big reason for that. And the Kurdish movement was actually quite an accident, I should say, because we were trying to form an international, support group or campaign on the question of political prisoners in India, which had become a very serious question by, that stage when I moved here around 2007. And one of the first things that I moved in 2007, and in 2007, one of our most well-known democratic rights activists, called Binayak Sen, he was arrested. And, that was, so I thought we should have something happening here. And I didn't know a soul in the UK when I came here, not one soul. So, and so when, anyway, we made, then you start meeting people, talking to people, etc. And there were others I networked with on international, political prisoners from Iran, from Turkey, from other places, and so on. And then somebody suggested that I meet a person called Estella from Peace in Kurdistan, and she might be somebody who might be interested in this project, and you should try and link up with her. And that's how I came to meet Estella. And it was kind of, it was just chance. And then that is when I became introduced to the Kurdish movement. And there were so many things in that movement which resonated for, us as a coming from India as an Indian activist. And that's when I thought, okay, this is something that I think I can give some time. And I became interested in the history and Ocalan's writings and all of that, which I did not know before. So yeah, that was a chance encounter that opened up a lot of things for me.
Hmm. Before we move on, there was one thing I wanted to ask you if you could elaborate on a little bit that you mentioned. This you were describing that in India you thought that you had some success with the economic and the political fronts of the struggle, but not that you had lagged behind on the theoretical or the philosophical dimension. And you mentioned the developments happening with the so-called cultural turn and so on. I'm wondering if you could elaborate a little bit what you think the significance of that lack of response was and why you think it's responsible for some kind of failure or shortcoming of the movement.
Yes, I mean, this is all retrospective because I didn't think about all this at the time. At the time, it was more a kind of sense that this is something that we have not worked out yet.
Hmm.
But looking back, I think you see, one of the, I'm just trying to see how I can put this. Einstein says something, and he says that if you keep doing the same thing over and over again, even when it does not produce any results, then either you are a fool or you are not able to, deal with the issues. And then he goes on to say that you cannot change things, reality, from the same level of consciousness that produced it. So you have to rise above the level of consciousness that produced the problem. So by the time our generation came into politics and so on, we had the ecological crisis, we had the gender and feminism and those women crisis, we had the third world and colonialism. These were all inescapable problems. And it seemed to me that the solutions that were coming were kind of rooted in the imaginaries of the 19th century, early 20th century, when the world had changed dramatically. So, and then I find, and this is still true, I think I still believe this, that our response is twofold. Either we say everything we did in the past was wrong, so just throw out everything, and we throw the baby with the bathwater. Or we say, everything about the past was perfect and we cannot throw anything out, and we should simply continue to do the same thing over and over again. And then you get into Einstein's problem of, repeatedly doing the same thing when it's not producing results. So I think that there is need for keeping the baby and finding a way of throwing out just the bathwater, but more importantly, finding clean water that we can then replace the bath with. If I were to, take that metaphor a little further and push it a little further. So that is the thinking that needs to come. And I think that is where, we are kind of stuck, if you like. I don't know if that answers your question.
It does, yeah, it makes sense. It's something that I would like to, and I think that we will return to as a theme a little bit later in the discussion. But if we can move on for now, to talk about one central set of issues that you were working with in both your academic work and your work with social movements, involves the intersection of the state, security, and self-determination. And I was wondering if you could share a little bit of your thoughts on this kind of constellation of issues. And sort of more specifically, we are now in an era of new globalized forms of neocolonialism and securitization. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the pathways for self-determination today.
Okay. As far as state and securitization is concerned, I just want to keep that short because I think it's a simple point and relatively people understand it, if nothing else from their everyday experience. I mean, if you drive beyond the speed limit, you will be stopped. The state is there, everywhere, and you will be fined and you have to pay it up or go to prison. This much everybody understands about the state. So one need not push it too much. There are just 2 points I wish to make about the state and securitization. One is where there is state, there is securitization. The institution of the state is founded on security. You see, because the justification of the state is security. That's what the state offers. You support my authority and I will protect you. This is the thing. And this has been there ever since the state has been there. If you look at ancient Nile Valley, all of those things, the river valley civilizations, whoever came in and established the state, offered security of land, agriculture, whatever was the life then. However, I think from that, we should not confuse, the modern state or use the term state in a generic way. Because the modern state is something quite different from the ancient state or the medieval state. Although in principle, securitization and state exists, has always existed. When did you ever have a king without, soldiers? It never happened. But the modern state is different because the modern state, by which I mean the state that comes into existence in Western Europe with the rise of capitalism. So France, Britain, Germany, Russia, that sort of thing with capitalism. And the difference is that the modern state depersonalizes authority and security. Because the modern state is founded on two basic pillars, if you like. One is professional army and armed forces, by which I mean internal police as well as external armed forces. And the other is on the bureaucracy, a civil service. These are the two pillars. Without this, there is no state. Before this, these two roles were not professionalized. So the armies, for example, under feudal authorities, the feudal lord had his peasants or whoever, and he said, come and fight for me, you had to go and fight for them, right? So it was a personal relationship between the law of feudal authority or it was some sort of transcendental justification. God has appointed me king, therefore all of you must obey me. But modern states are different because you have a professional army and a professional bureaucracy whose livelihood and living depends on keeping up the securitization and keeping up the governance and rule and authority. And there is no personal relationship, because that's what professionalism means. When I say I'm a professional civil servant, I have no personal relationship with you. It is always mediated through the law. So you can come and tell me I don't have a house to live, and I will have to say, sorry, there is no law that says I have to give you a house, even though I am a public servant. You see? So the whole thing about security and administration becomes depersonalized, and it becomes professionalized. That's the other side of depersonalization, is professionalism. And then the state needs to find the money to support those two institutions. And therefore, where does it get money from? Obviously, people with money, the corporations, the merchants, the bankers, all of that. So there is an inextricable nexus, if you like, or it's inseparable, this reliance of the state, the modern state, because it's not possible to maintain these institutions without that. And at the same time, it's not possible to have an economy, without the state providing these two institutions. So I think that is where we shouldn't get mixed up between, the state was always there. Yes, it was always there, but the modern state is different. And securitization then becomes essential part of it. Now you may ask, if that is the essential part, why do we have all this jargon about, democracy, and everybody talks about democracy, etc., etc. And here also, I think it's important to recognize that the flip side of democracy is national security. There is no democracy without national security. So democracy talks about freedom of the citizens, but national security says, there is no freedom. And the way in which the two are linked and the interplay of those two things are really essential to understand if we want to understand state and securitization in the modern context. Yeah. So why do we need the democracy talk? Because if I have all taxation, requires some form of consent, because you're asking me to part with my money, which I have earned after a lot of hard work, right? So without the democracy talk, I am not going to be committed to give up anything for this professional army and a professional state. So, the democracy to take away money, national security to keep those two institutions in place. And that's the state and securitization. Now you ask me, about self-determination, which is, of course, a very, very critical issue, according to me, partly because history demands that we people of the third world, we revisit our own understandings of self-determination as it was in the past. And that's why I think that if we have to go further down the road of freedom, this issue needs to be revisited. I think every time we have fought for self-determination, there was always a little bit of freedom that we got. And I think that was important. And in the national liberation struggles of the 19th, 20th century, which was one of the most powerful anti-colonial movements, we understood self-determination as political self-determination. And partly that was also because, the influence of Western democratic revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, all of those things kind of informed the way we thought about self-determination. And we believed the normative promises of liberalism, that if you get political freedom, you will have the freedom to organize your lives the way you want it. Yeah. Now, clearly, 70 years after the UN, it's very clear that that is not the case. Were we wrong in thinking that? I don't think we can go back and make those kind of judgments, because you can't read history backwards. Because it is a fact that the national liberation struggles brought down the old empires, although it was not the only factor. It is a fact that, it was a huge confidence boosting exercise for people, colonized people, coming out of slavery, coming out of semi-serfdom, indentured labor, coming out of that. It was a huge boost of confidence and self-assertion and all of that, which we need to acknowledge. And whatever we did then was not all, as I said, rubbish in retrospect. But at the same time, we need to acknowledge that we need to move forward. We can't be stuck in those national liberation struggles and start defending everything that our states do. Look at my state, look at Turkey, look at, we can't possibly do that. And that is why renegotiating the meanings of self-determination for the colonized subjects becomes such an important issue. So if you ask me, what are the things we should take away from our past experience? One thing is that, political freedom alone is not enough. And economic self-determination is now literally the agenda that history is putting in front of us. The more globalization, the more, you look at some of the struggles that are going on around the world, and a lot of it is about asserting control over your own economic life. And that then becomes, an important challenge to liberalism, because liberalism promises you, with political freedom, you can do all the other things. No. On the other hand, we need, there cannot be political freedom if you don't have economic freedom. And there cannot be economic freedom if you don't have political freedom. Those two things are inseparable. And I think that is where the conversation needs to go. But to link that self-determination to what I said earlier about Einstein and being at the same level of consciousness. Since 1945, when the United Nations and the so-called New World Order was established and all the anti-colonial move, the colonies became independent and so on. Since then, bit by bit, the third world has tried to use the UN, has tried to use those forums to gain economic self-determination. It's not like they've not tried and everybody, nobody has tried to do anything. We need to acknowledge what people have tried to do, and especially our previous generations have tried to do. And they have tried to do that. They have taken on the transnational companies in the UN, tried to get, a center code on transnational companies. They have tried to have sovereignty over natural resources. They have looked at equitable trade systems, etc., etc. Instead of getting more freedoms, we are finding you're getting less freedoms. So earlier, you could not have a government of, the kind of government people wanted. You could not have a mix of socialist, capitalist governments because they were all part of the Cold War justification for, being regime change and whatever else. Now, of course, you cannot have any government that is anti-globalization. So, we cannot then discount all of that. But where has that brought us? That whatever the new self-determination, renegotiating the ideas and concepts that and I say renegotiating because I don't think that any single person has an answer. This is where our conversations need to go. This is why I'm interested in the Kurdish movement. This is why I'm interested in African movements, etc., because we need to have this conversation as colonized subjects, revisit this experience. But certain ingredients in that I think we can safely say, must be there. One is the gender question, the women's question. And that can no longer become just a collateral thing or something that will just happen. What is the place of women in this new self-determined world that we want? The environment question is staring at us. That cannot be a sideline thing. The question of economic autonomy and state is a much more complicated one, because we need to resist imperialism, you need some sort of organized force. Yeah? And most national liberation struggles copied the state, or most socialist struggles for that matter, copied the state that they were resisting, and in the end became like them. Because it was like they cast themselves in the image of the same oppressors that they were opposing. So the question of but we still need to resist imperialism, and so you still need to be an organized force. You cannot do that. You cannot be idealistic and think, all you need to do is be, whatever, and things will go away. No, nothing goes away. Nobody gives up power just like that. But at the same time, how do we stop ourselves from becoming like our oppressors? And that requires a parallel kind of organization that needs to grow and emerge in the course of that resistance, that gives communities, gives localities, gives places. There's a difference between space and place, and gives places a very strong position and place in this resistance. How it will happen, how we can do that, I have no answers to. All I can say is that this is the problem that we need to be talking about.
Something, an additional dimension I wanted to add, which you did speak to, and I wanted to hear your thoughts on, is you discussed the globalized nature of particularly economic ordering and political as well, that the nation state is a global ordering system of interlocking nation states. And together, the economic and the political order is enforced by certain dominant actors and overwhelming force. And it seems to me that the conditions are developing, and what we saw from the shortcomings of the previous era of national liberation struggle, that the response for self-determination has to respond at that global level. That there is a need for some kind of global response. And again, I am with you in terms of how that can look, what that means. It is, I think, impossible for any person to say. It has to be worked out through developments and through dialogue. But because one thing that is involved in self-determination as well as democracy is who the self is, who the demos are. It's who the political community is that is making the decision. And the question of what a nation, what a people are, is a very large one with a very large, history of study and scholarship around it. But this issue of the ability for a national community to control their own development, control their own destiny, order their own life in a system of globalized order and control, I think is part of that limitation that the national liberation form runs into. It was something recognized by Rosa Luxemburg, that small states won't be able to control their own destiny in an era of economic imperialism, something talked about by Nkrumah, about the impediments offered by financialized neocolonialism and so on. So I think there is a need for some kind of global response. I think the non-aligned movement was some kind of maybe motion in that direction or something like that, some kind of global network alliance to create a force that can push back against globalized control. But I think I just wanted to get your thoughts on, I wanted to add to that list of dimensions, some kind of necessity for globalized or international, in that sense, inter-peoples alliance and move for self-determination, to bring it on the table as a global discussion in that sense.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. We are not the first persons to be talking about internationalism.
That's very true.
Because capitalism was always international, and it was always global. But again, we need to make distinguish between the different periods and how this global idea or resistance as a global idea manifested in those conditions. For example, whole concept of Pan-Africanism, Pan-Arabism, was the product of the slave liberation struggles in the United States, and then slaves were liberated, and there was this thing about, and many of the Pan-Africanists were from, liberated slaves from North America coming here, political idea of unity or unifying Africa, or if you look at the Ghadar movement in South Asia, for example, they conceptualized anti-colonial struggles as a global one, because they said, if we are fighting the British Empire, but the British Empire is everywhere. So wherever the British Empire is, we need to organize. So they went, in those days, went as further afield as Brazil and Argentina and Kenya and Singapore and Malaysia. So that was the idea, and I think these ideas have always been there. But the difference is that so if you like, it parallels the empire, So the empire initially was, a series of small European states engaged in slave trade and whatever. And so the idea of unity was also mirrored that kind of thing. Then, of course, you have the major empire systems, Britain, France being the most leading ones. And this idea that we should organize across the empire. And now the empire has become like a, monolith, if you like, and has become a global one. So the idea that we need to organize across the world is not a new one.
Very true.
However, I think that the difference, what we need to be very clear about is that this internationalism that we are talking about in the present context can only be an anti-imperialist, coalition of forces, if you like. And therefore, the push for that comes from the former colonies, the newly, the independent, the third world, etc. I mean, that is where the push has to come. And the reason I mentioned this is because, as I said earlier, we need to learn our lessons from the last round of national liberation if we have to go to another round of national liberation struggles, if you like. And in the last round, we were led to believe, or we believed, that it was possible to have Western-style capitalist development without colonies. So we could become a United States. We could have the standard of living that was there in the United States or, Britain or France or Europe or wherever else without ever colonizing anybody. And what the last 70 years has taught us is that this is not possible. You cannot become like a United States without colonizing somebody. And because we can't colonize America, we only have the option of colonizing our own people. And by this, I mean, as an Indian, within India, or, go to other small states. For example, some of the Indian industries now going and purchasing mines in Ecuador and, and Bolivia and doing, what they do at home or what the Western mining companies did to us in the past and now. So what the last 70 years has said clearly is whatever the new freedom struggle, there cannot be any colonization of anybody in it. And in that sense, I think that means we need to be truly, liberated from imperialism, capitalism, colonialism, all of those things, because otherwise the freedom is not possible. Because we can't, who do we colonize? What kind of slave trade can we engage in, having come as descendants of slaves and indentured labor? Who can we colonize? So I think this reality is enormous and it's very big, and it's a huge reality that stares at us and we need to confront head on. And that would be really a qualitative shift from all the previous liberation struggles, which somehow or the other clung on to, a liberal framework, a normative change and all that. And this round is really the final round. Either we get it right this time or we perish.
Yeah, the stakes are
I mean, these are some big, sweeping, big ideas, but, sometimes it's not bad to talk about big things.
I agree with that. Because there are big things around and at some point they have to be addressed.
Articulated.
Correct. So following on from this issue of internationalism, I wanted to ask you, well, so one such proposal that there is around these days, which we've spoken about already, is from the Kurdish movement. And as I mentioned, and you discussed a little bit, you've been a longtime friend of the Kurdish movement. In your preface to the second volume of Öcalan's Manifesto of the Democratic Civilization, you describe Öcalan as an Eastern thinker. And you have compared elsewhere Öcalan's proposal for a new kind of political organization for kind of democratic coexistence of peoples in a shared homeland, which terms democratic confederalism and democratic nation. You've compared this to the vision of a movement you mentioned a little bit before, the Ghadar movement, which is an early 20th century Indian political movement about which you've written and spoken about very extensively. So I was hoping you could elaborate a little bit on this, where you think this parallel arises from, what you think its basis is, and how you view these two examples as well as their parallels with one another. What kind of lessons or insight you think can be drawn from that for addressing the issue of internationalism today?
I think to say Öcalan is a man of the East is quite literal also. He is a man of the East. So let's be very clear of that. I mean, that was his formative experience. He was a Kurdish man. He grew up in a very Islamic society and,
Absolutely.
very much. But when I read his works, what struck me was he never holds himself back from talking about those influences, of talking about Eastern thinkers, of talking about, references to Quran or references to various verses or various, he's never shy. He's not trying to hide. He's not trying to be, a Marxist with no culture, or, Western culture is the only culture kind of things. I mean, he's open to other influences, but he's not trying to hide who he is or his own formative influences, for that matter. And he's not in awe or in thrall of anything that comes from the West. And I thought that was interesting. I was quite struck by that, because with a lot of intellectuals from third world countries, especially, and this is the colonizing of the mind that, I sometimes talk about, we are in thrall of, Hegel or somebody, as if the East had no thinkers of their own. We are this great civilization, but we never had thinkers. We never had our philosophers. Why are we shy about talking about them? And so I think that is something that struck me about him. But equally, what was extraordinary, and this is, I think, increasing, the more I think about it, the more I think that being somebody from, call it the East or the third world or whatever, is actually an intellectual strength. Because for many of us, because of the colonial, influence and the colonial education, we read Western texts. We read Plato, we read Aristotle, we read, Hegel, Marx, Kant, whatever. But we are also read our own stuff. We read our own writers also. So we know Hafez or Rumi or, Bulle Shah, or if I have to take from India, or Kabir, or, all those people. So we have this, two worlds that are in us because of our positionality as people of the colonial world. Also, if you come from a third world country, you need to know your Kant and your Hegel and whatever to be able to deal with, But if you are from a European country or a United States, you don't have to know Kabir or Bulle Shah or, Rumi or any of them to deal with us. So, I mean, and this is combined, this reality of our knowledge systems sits within a power structure where if you you are a Western academic in a Western university and you speak about something, it has power. It has traction. People will listen. And if I am from, a rural university in India, who cares? I have the most amazing ideas, but who cares? So what struck me about when, as being part of the Kurdish movement and observing it as a non-Kurd, as an outsider, if you like, was that, the smallest reference to a European thinker or a Western thinker was immediately seized on by the Western intellectual classes as, oh, look, he's quoting Bookchin. Isn't that amazing? Look, he's quoting X and Y. And leave out completely, all the others from the other parts of the world that he's also quoting. But when I read it, I read both. He's talking this about Bookchin, and he's talking, something about, another thinker from Babylonia or medieval, Middle East or Central Asia or somebody. And I think, all right, I can see where this is coming from. And I think there are two ways of looking at this. For Western people, what stops them from reading our texts? What stops them? Because I don't know ancient Greece. I read Aristotle through translations. So you can also read, Kabir through translations. You can read Rumi through translations. Why don't you? And why don't you bring them into your work? Especially when there is this constant thing about, oh, we respect the third world, oh, we are multicultural, oh, we are inclusive and, equality. Then read. What stops you? And there is something that stops you from doing that. And I would like us to think more about that. As far as people from the East are concerned, why do you completely discount that knowledge? Was there nothing in it? I mean, did we all become this great civilization without our thinkers? And if they are, why do we discount it? Why are we fearful of it? Why are we not putting it out and saying this? But I'll just conclude this point by making an observation about why doing this at both on ends, the East and the West, is so essential. Coming back to Einstein, if we are to get out of the frames, that have imprisoned us, then we need to actually, where is that intellectual resource going to come from? Because knowledge is a social product. It comes from society, it comes from the world, it comes from the history. Where is that going to come from? It's not going to come from capitalist knowledge. We have to look further afield. Some sort of intellectual renaissance. And that renaissance cannot happen if you only read Kant and Marx and, Aristotle and Plato. It has to come from somewhere else. And I think that is where, for me, it is, we started this discussion by talking about, having rethinking and renegotiating some of those concepts. And in that renegotiation, I think we have a huge world outside of the West, and there are a lot of intellectual, conceptual, philosophical resources there, which we shouldn't shy from using.
Well, I think, as you said earlier on, this really speaks to this issue of the mental and ideological aspects of colonialism, and I think the impact and legacies that this has on both the colonizer and the colonized run very, very deeply. And even though there's been, work exploring and unpacking what that means and a tradition of doing so, it is still, I think it's quite a profound issue and very difficult to grapple with. And I'm very much in agreement. The part of moving beyond it is breaking the limitation of these frames. Because as you said, most thinkers outside of the Western tradition, part of the tactic is to try to show that they are somehow a spin-off or a poor copy of some Western thinker. You know, there's always attempts to delegitimize
Yes.
somehow, and that legitimation comes through tying
Yes.
with someone from the Western canon. And so that's part of that very deep, I think, colonial attitude that has to be undone.
Yes. Yes.
But so this issue
and what I call in very simple language, I call it the "we also had" argument. You know, oh, you had an Aristotle, we had a, you know, but it doesn't need to be exactly the same. Yeah. Anyway, go on. Sorry, I cut you.
This issue of the parallels between Öcalan and the Gadar movement and the lessons for internationalism.
Yes, that was another thing for me. That came as a complete surprise, because the way he conceptualizes confederalism, democratic confederalism, as communities that were federated, if you like, and not in the American sense of a federation, which is formed on economic interests, but rather, a holistic, economically, politically, autonomous communities coming together to form this confederation. And this was very much at the heart of the freedom struggles in the early 20th century in India, because India is, like many Eastern societies, a very diverse society, because, and this is, and as I say often, multiculturalism for us was not something that was brought about by modernization. Multiculturalism was simply, evolution of a society over time where there is pluralism, new types of thinkers. Some people abandoned, there was the Abrahamic tradition, okay, Jesus Christ, and then from that came Prophet Muhammad. So, this kind of thing. And so some remained Christians, others became followers of the Prophet. So both people lived in the same place. This is the source of pluralism, is time. And time makes plurality, if you like, because it introduces diversity in so many ways. So when I was kind of reading about, and this was a big challenge for the freedom struggle, how do you oppose imperialism and the British Empire, which is a very organized, centralized power, without becoming like them? And one of the things that they said very clear, they foresaw very clearly, was a liberal style democracy was not going to work for us, because it becomes a numbers game. Whereas our communities are not numbers. It is about history, and it is about evolution of certain social groups who have evolved in a certain way and have continued those, traditions and practices and systems and whatever. So for them, the question was, how do we organize an alternate politics? And, there was in particular, a guy called Ubaidullah Sindhi, who was one of the most leading Gadar scholars. There were others as well, but he redrafted a constitution for Azad Hindustan, which is free India. And he said, how should an Azad Hindustan, what kind of constitution should it have? And he said, look, this kind of federalism of the American kind is not going to work for us. Instead, what he says is, we need to recognize language, which is a huge part, because language is what we use to communicate with others. And then he says that every community must come together and form a federation. And that was the Confederation of Nations. But when I was reading that, what struck me was, because his works are not translated, and I was reading it in our, own languages, and in Hindustani, he uses the word qaum and watan. And that is where I started questioning the way we use nation and the nation state, which is a hyphenated word. Yeah. So in the, you know, in that part of the world, in many parts, and I think this is true of South Asia, I can say, but it's also of Arab regions, Central Asia, and so on. The watan is the land. So you have affiliation to the land. Yeah. But all people who have affiliation to the land need not be of the same religion and the same language and the same thing. So you have qaum, which reflects the communities of different types, and you have watan. And there was no necessary correlation between the two. So many qaums can be affiliated to the same watan. Or sometimes you could have one qaum or two qaums affiliated to one watan. Yeah, these were not necessarily coterminous. And when I started thinking about those concepts, I said, you know, but in Europe, they are coterminous. The English nation formed the English state. The French nation formed the French state. And all the others were minorities. You know, whereas if you look at the democratic confederalism model that Ghadar movement proposed, there is no minority majority here. Because a small qaum can also be part of the same watan, and a large qaum can also be part of the same watan, and they need to coexist because you need the watan for both. Mm-hmm. So that's sort of the polity and the political arrangements for a shared homeland.
Well, I think,
and that was what, and that idea went away because in the Indian freedom movement, the liberals then took over. The Ghadarites were ruthlessly, there was bloody repression and they were put down, and that entire tradition was put down. And nobody was willing to talk about them and their contribution to the freedom struggle after independence. So the post-independence history in India is written by, you know, liberal historians who come to power. And the Ghadar history was kind of always remained a folk history until recently, when another disillusioned generation is starting to ask questions about you know, what did we do right, what did we do wrong, kind of things, those kind of issues. So when I was reading Ocalan, it really struck me that he should be saying something similar. And I'm sure Ocalan never read Ghadar. He never read the Ghadar history, because even many Indians have not read them, or South Asians have not read, you know, kind of thing. And so how did those ideas resurface in another part of the world that was suffering in the same way as India was at that time? So that is what, and that also reinforced my thinking, oh, he's a man of the East, because that thought process is coming from somewhere. It's not coming from nowhere. You know, because all all thinking is social. So anything we think has come from somewhere. So, and that was quite astonishing. And I'm still very astonished by the similarities in their arguments.
Well, there's two points I wanted to make quickly. First, about this, you made the point about Europe and the correlation of a nation to a particular land. I think it is also important to mention too that is a relatively modern phenomenon that was a historically engineered project.
Yes.
That if we rewind 200 years and look at France or what is today Germany or so, there was a very different picture in terms of language, in terms of belief systems, communities,
traditions. Yes. Yeah, and that is also the modernization project.
Exactly. This social engineering project to make the homogenous nation that corresponds to a nation state, which brings up again this question of nations and communities and political communities. But I share your astonishment and fascination with the way that these parallels arise seemingly independently of one another somehow, or without mutual knowledge of one another. but somehow emerging out of conditions that must share some kind of similarities at a deep level to allow for such parallels. And
Yes.
I think there's an interesting, I think the parallel between Bookchin and Öcalan is interesting in this way too, because as you mentioned before, you know, Öcalan is someone that very much does not shy away from, and quite the opposite, is very conscious of how he is formed by the traditions of the region where he comes from, and it's a very rich and ancient one. And he is influenced somehow, into varying degrees, there's some debate about it, I guess, by Bookchin and his writings about confederalism as a model for organization. But something that I find really interesting is that Bookchin is very admittedly Eurocentric or Western-centric, which he can be criticized for, but he is drawing this model out of the history endemic to that region, both of city-states and city leagues, like the Hanseatic League in Europe, and the council system in early pre-revolutionary America, as well as the indigenous confederations like the Iroquois League and tribal confederation and so on. Whereas Öcalan draws the confederalist model out of the history of that region, the history of tribal confederations, people's confederations, even to some extent the millet system in the Ottoman Empire and so on, and ends up at something looking quite similar, drawn very much organically out of that history of that region. And I find the way that these parallels surface quite, quote unquote, organically from different parts of the world, I find that very interesting. To me, it indicates that there must be something in it.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I want to ask you next about the situation in India today, or in the most recent period. So in recent years, we've seen conditions worsening under the new liberalization and the Hindu nationalism of the Modi regime. And very recently, we've seen a mass mobilization of farmers creating sit-ins, encampments around major cities to protest against declining conditions and new agricultural laws. So I was wondering if you can give us some background and an overview of the broader situation today, or in the most recent period in India, and how you evaluate the prospects for struggle and transformation in India today.
Oh, that's it's I could give you about 5 lectures on that
I
one.
suppose all of these questions are unfair.
There are a lot of questions, and I'm just thinking how to summarize and how to give you a very short overview of some very big issues. But first of all, I think you mentioned Hindu nationalism. And I think let's be very clear that, and maybe for the listeners as well, that we don't use the word Hindu nationalism. It is Hindutva nationalism. This is not about quibbling about words, because the word, see, one thing is that all far-right fascist type ideologies, language is very important for them. You know, how the play of language and the use and misuse and abuse of language is what they rely on, because there is no substance in anything. For example, you look at, you know, with Israel, any criticism of Israel, the state of Israel, and you are anti-Semitic because of an association in the past about, you know, the Holocaust and whatever else. So the word Hindu is a very generic term. And unlike the Abrahamic religions, Hinduism has no centralized authority. There is no pope. There is no single text. There is no, it's a very decentralized, very diffused belief system, which over the years, this is how all the qaums, the communities were formed, you know, through evolution, etc. I don't want to go into the South Asia as a very devolved system of economy, political economy. Sociologists have called it village republics, where every village had its autonomy. That's where we're coming from. And so everybody who believed in a certain, broad cultural or social norms or texts or, deities and gods and goddesses and whatever else, call themselves Hindus. And there are huge differences in the way, Hinduism is practiced and understood in every region, in every district. My mother's side of the family understands it differently from my father's side of the family. And both are, Tamils, and both are Hindus and whatever. So the challenge for the far right or the fascists was how you centralize this. Because centralizing power and authority is fundamental to fascism. Otherwise, there's no fascism if you don't centralize power. But how do you centralize this crazy, diverse, where everybody has their, people will just say, oh, in their family, they do this in this way. In our family, we do it that way. That's the level of plurality. So how do you, centralize this power? And so the founder of the National Volunteer Corps, which is called the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, RSS in short, their ideologues in 1928 and at that time, they were very aware of this fact. How do you centralize such a diverse society? And so he says he never wanted to get into an argument of what is or is not Hinduism. So he says this is not about religion, straight away. And he says that this is a nationalist project. And he calls that nationalist project Hindutva, which means Hindu-ness. You don't have something called a Christian-ness. Either you are Christian or not Christian. You don't have something called Muslim-ness. Either you are a follower of Islam or you are not a follower of Islam. So, but there was nothing in Hindu society that allowed that kind of interpretation. And so he says, let's forget about religion. This is not about religion. This is about Hindutva, a sense of Hindu-ness. And we need to, so it's a cultural thing, and we need to mobilize that culture for the nationalist project. And that is why it is extremely important that people, when they refer to Indian far right or RSS or whatever, they use the correct term Hindutva. Because what the far right is now doing is anybody who criticizes the government, like Israel, they say, oh, these people are against Hindus. So you're playing right into their hands by using the word Hindu, because then everybody is Hindu. I mean, and people say, oh, these people are somehow against us. And then you are then on the defensive, like with Israel. You criticize Israel, they say you're anti-Semitic. Then you have to defend yourself. No, I'm not anti-Semitic. I really believe in, thing, and I oppose the Holocaust, mea culpa. I've never said that. So you get into that. So let us not put ourselves on the back foot by using the wrong words, which is going to affect, people. So I think it's very important for listeners to understand that they use the term Hindutva nationalism.
Thank you for that.
And that is, so it's not just linguistic, semantic quibbling. It's a very political, substantial political question there.
That makes sense, yeah.
Since, okay, where does this begin and end is always a difficult one, because everything has, a child is in a mother's womb, and then it becomes a child, and then it becomes an adult. So where did the child begin? You can have a question. But I think there are certain key moments which we need to flag up that has built this. This has not come overnight. Let's be very clear on that. It's not about Modi being elected in 2014 and then bingo, everything changed. It has been building up. The key moment was the destruction of a very ancient mosque called Babri Masjid in 1992. And that was based on a nationwide mobilization, political mobilization, which started in the 80s. But the key thing is that India, which was a very centralized, planned economy, as was common in many third world countries after independence, by the 1980s, it was economically, down. It had to go with the arms bowl to IMF for saving the rupee and so on, and signed up to the globalization agenda. The key thing to note is that the globalization agenda was preceded by a complete hammering of the organized labor movement in India. Because after the emergency was lifted in 1977, there was an upsurge of labor movements, and that there was systematic decimation of organized labor. And the textile strike in Bombay, of which we were all very much, a part of, was a critical moment in that, because about 100,000 workers lost their job. The strike went on for 1 year. It is supposed to be the world's largest strike, etc., etc. But that was, the reason I'm pointing this out is that when things don't change because some politicians make some speeches somewhere, things change only when you are able to destroy something to build something. So destroying the labor movement was the basis on which globalization came. So that is one part of it. The other thing that is worth noting is that with globalization came the steady rise of fundamentalism, Hindutva fundamentalism. Yeah, so it begins there. But there are certain key moments, like the destruction of the mosque was one of those key moments. The genocide in Gujarat of Muslims by the same, Modi and Shah government that were there was another significant moment in that development. And of course, the 2014 elections, for the first time, we had a central government, a so-called strong central government with no coalitions, nothing. And when they came into power, their next agenda was to come to power again so that they get two, things to carry out their agenda. Key elements are the doing away with the secular constitution and in establishing a Hindutva constitution or prioritizing. So, but again, in such a diverse country, where do you target this? Because you know that in India, the caste system is a major issue as well. So there's a huge complex situation there. If you add the Muslims and the Dalits and the indigenous people and the various regions, the Brahmins and the upper castes are the minorities. So the politics of minority majority becomes problematic. But this is to just give you a context. But since then, there has been struggle after struggle after struggle after struggle with every step that the government has taken. For example, beef ban. Yeah. Oh, we are a Hindu nation and we can't, we don't eat beef, which is utter rubbish, because for a start, only the upper caste don't eat beef. Yeah, the indigenous people eat beef, the Christians eat beef, the Muslims eat beef, the Dalits eat beef. And even among the upper castes, there are many intermediary castes who eat beef. So in terms of numbers, it's one of them. But then this is how upper caste ideologies have had a resurgence, if you like. And then you had, riots against somebody suspected of having beef in their fridge. suspected only, no evidence needed, and so on. So that kind of thing has been going on. Then, of course, the CAA protests, the Citizenship Amendment Act, and there are two other legislation. I don't want to get into too much detail about the laws, but basically targeting, questioning the citizenship. You have to prove your citizenship to be part of, and an elaborate administrative process to establish that. That was another key moment, and so on. In a nutshell, each moment has kind of, expanded the whole scope of the protests. Then there was COVID, and the reaction to COVID was, 8 o'clock in the evening, the government said from midnight, complete lockdown. And Western newspapers, everybody applauded and said, oh, this is great, taking strong action. We all seem to like strong men these days. But what was the reality on the ground? Millions of migrant workers who were working in cities were suddenly overnight, without food, without whatever. But that pales into insignificance when you compare how states used that moment to drive a completely different agenda. 9 to 10 states immediately, within months of the lockdown, introduced legislation doing away with 8-hour working day, doing away with labor protections and thing in the name of post-COVID recovery. For post-COVID recovery, we need foreign investments, we need investors in our states. And so, these labor laws are keeping them away, are keeping investors away. So we reintroduced 12-hour working day, 72-hour weeks, going back to 100 years, putting us back to 100 years. And this is an aspect that not many have talked about, including self-regulation of occupational health and safety. So industries, there are no, because the inspectorate, the old factory inspector, and agreed they were very corrupt and whatever else, are useless and they are corrupt. So we do them away and we say, industries, you can regulate yourself. Just go online and fill out a form, tick all the boxes, and everything will be fine. So this is the kind of thing. So the farmers' agitation is the most recent one. And the farmers' agitation, if you want to understand that, you need to understand the place of the farmer in Indian psyche, if you like. Because whatever, across political differences, whatever, people have a very embedded sentiment about farmers in their hearts, because they are seen as the annadata, or the provider of food, people who feed us. And the people who feed us are culturally very important, because we don't push away people who feed us very easily. I mean, culturally, even if I come to your house and you give me food, then I am required, I'm ethically obliged to be, well disposed to you because you have fed me. So the hand that feeds is a very emotive issue. And these are hands that feed us, that are now being told, you are out, to allow agribusiness to enter into, competition with them. This is like traditional farmers who. So that has completely flipped this expectation of a very authoritarian government. The kind of political arrests that we have seen, the kind of imprisonments, the kind of, national investigative agencies just knocking on people's door and doing all that. All that is still happening. It's not like those things are not happening. But as far as people are concerned, it has kind of, it has crossed a line now. because across the board, people think this is not right. And so whether they are actively sitting there on strikes or whether they are going about their business, thing, or whether they are involved in protests in any way, the feeling that what is happening to the farmers is not right. And that is one. And the other part of it is that sense of confidence that, yes, this can be challenged. And farmers are not Hindus, Muslims, farmers are you have Hindu farmers, Muslim farmers, Sikh farmers. Farmers are everybody. Anybody who tills the land is a farmer or works on a land is a farmer. So it cuts across all those divisions. So it's a very interesting moment because in this agitation, there is a fundamental challenge to the WTO regime on agriculture. There is a fundamental challenge to fascism in India. And there is a fundamental challenge to a model of development and global agribusiness, and a fundamental challenge to, the model of development that we've been following. Because if you don't want that global agribusiness, then what is the other kind of agriculture that we want? Because 60%, 65% of the country is dependent on agriculture.
Mm.
And before that, there were, a spate of farmers' suicides. After the WTO agreement on agriculture was signed by India, there were, like, according to government, 300,000 farmers committed suicide. We think it's much more, So it's, even in the agrarian sector, the crisis has been building up. And we've reached a point where there is a virtual collapse of the agrarian economy. And what this movement is doing is to say we can't allow it to collapse. We have to somewhere, hold it up. So that is as far as I don't know if in a snapshot I have given you all the various contemporary movements, from political prisoners to, caste, to Muslims, to Kashmir I've not mentioned, Northeast I've not mentioned, but there you go.
Yeah, there's too much, I think.
There is a lot to talk, but I hope you got something out of it.
Very much so. I appreciate it. On this issue of the farmers' protest, there was one also issue I wanted to ask you about. At the encampments there, they've sort of, at least aspiring self-sustaining encampments there that are. We've seen there is very rich cultural expression from. As you said, there's all kinds of different people present at these protests, because all kinds of different people are farmers, and for everything from art to music to food in these community kitchens that they have built. Can you share some of your thoughts about the relationship between art, or more generally culture, and resistance?
I think to call it, to comment on a relationship between art and culture and politics is something that sounds too European and too Western to me, because art and culture is part of everything that has always happened. There's a long tradition of this that goes back to, I don't know, 1200 AD or even before, God knows when. We have always had a tradition of expressing through songs and through music, especially poetry, music and songs. I was talking to somebody, another somebody from Pakistan the other day, and she was telling me, actually, and she's a cultural scholar, and she was saying, we've never had the tradition of novels in South Asia much. It's a modern, relatively modern thing. Whereas for us, the poetry, and this is not just coming because of the farmers' agitation. Every political movement in India, every single campaign in India, every single, and not India, South Asia, because culturally we are part of the same milieu, if you like, has their own singers and, musicians and poets and things like that. This happens all the time. Political meetings rarely start without some poetry, some music, some, song. And looking back, I mean, if you look at freedom struggle, for example, the Communist Party of India, and I often say this, whatever they may have done right or wrong, the one right thing they did was they put their top, party members into cultural field. So the old cinema, for example, Raj Kapoor, very popular from China, Middle East, you talk about Raj Kapoor films, everybody knows about them, and the songs. This tradition is very, very deep rooted. We cannot meet sometimes without actually bursting into a verse when talking about these things. So this is such an intrinsic part that I doubt a event like surrounding Delhi and an occupation of, by farmers would go without music and song and poetry. That would not be an Indian protest if it happened. So it's an impossibility. For Narmada Bachao, the Save Narmada campaign, they had their music troops. The communist movements, they have their own music troops. Everybody has their music and poetry in particular. Whether this will translate into a novel, that will be for me the interesting cultural question. I'm not at all surprised that people are singing songs and reading poetry there. But will this translate into an epic novel? That would be a very interesting cultural question.
I suppose time will tell. So the final issue I wanted to ask you about was philosophy. So we've mentioned it a couple of times thus far. You have a background in philosophy in multiple traditions, as you have mentioned. And you've spoken elsewhere recently about the decline of the concern for and the space for philosophy in the contemporary neoliberalized educational environment or academy. The big questions like nature of human existence and the meaning of life and these kind of things. And you've spoken already up to this point a little bit about this issue of raising consciousness, coming to a new level to be able to address the issues that we face. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit about how you view the significance of philosophy, how you view, again, maybe the relationship between philosophy and struggle, and what sort of philosophical project you believe is needed at this time, this issue of elaborating on what you mean by this issue of consciousness raising.
Okay. Let me just begin by clarifying, what you said about a background in philosophy. I don't have a background as such. I was an undergraduate student and I was so besotted with Western philosophy that I did honors in Western philosophy because it was completely, I was in awe of, thing and read Kant and Russell and all of that because it was like an eye-opening for me as an undergraduate student. But that's where my philosophy then, that's my training. As far as multiple traditions, I don't have any particular training in Eastern philosophy other than the fact that I was raised in an Indian family. And so there was always talk about various, philosophical, social, and other issues. In particular, coming back to your other point, poetry. Because in India, we have what we call the philosopher saint tradition or the poet saint tradition, which goes back to the 12th, century AD, Kabir and the South and, various other. And what these thinkers did was to compose philosophy in poetry. And those were songs we all sang because it was sung in our homes, we sang. And then when you start thinking, first you just sing and then you start thinking about those words, and then so that is the other philosophical tradition. And then of course, when you are confronted with these big questions of our times and politics, etc., then those voices sort of come back to you somewhere, and that's the kind of thing. So just to clarify that, the reason I say that it is extremely important to have another philosophical renaissance, if you like. One of the things that modernity, capitalist modernity does is capitalist modernity succeeds by destroying philosophy. So the first separation in the so-called scientific revolution that comes is the separation of philosophy and science, law and ethics. See, this would be unthinkable for people before. How can law is the base, ethics is the basis of law. But then that is completely, so law is made by a political discourse, and the political discourse may have ethics, whatever.
Science
so
was called natural philosophy.
Yeah. So those kind of separations. And this has gone on for so long now, and our knowledge systems are so fragmented that we have no way of thinking about ourselves as human. What does it mean to be a human being in the 21st century? What does it mean to, be, what is, how do we speak about human destiny? There is no language to speak about human destiny. Tell me, how would you speak about, what is human destiny? And they will say, my destiny, your destiny. No, human destiny is not your destiny and my destiny. It is about all of us as human beings, Or they would say climate change. And, everybody, climate change. And so to save the environment, to save the tiger, you encircle the villages and stop the villagers from going into the tiger reserves now. The tiger comes and takes away the child from the village because the tiger's habitat has been reduced by the industrialists, taking over land for industries. Right? And the villager can't defend his child from the tiger now because that becomes anti-environment. And environmental groups can get very passionate about these things. And so social movements can get very, farmers can get very passionate about it. Why should they not save their children? So, this kind of madness that this fragmentation has introduced, the fragmented knowledge in the name of disciplinary specializations, in the name of each one for themselves, each market segment. So you're a farmer, you can speak about farms. You're a worker, you can. So what happens if the farmer and the worker, their interests don't meet? Do they cease to be human? So we have no language now to speak about human destiny. What is our future? Are we all going to be destroyed by climate change, as everybody says? But how do you speak about that? And I think that has come about because we have over 500 years systematically undermined philosophy. Again, coming back, I've mentioned Einstein 3 times today, but coming back to it, if you want to go into another level of consciousness, we need to have explicit engagement about philosophy. What is human ethics? What is our responsibility to each other and to nature? What is our destiny? How do we deal with that destiny, if there is one? And what is it to be human in today's world? So I mean, and if we don't come back to these very basic questions, and if we are defensive or fear or hesitant to raise these questions, we are going to remain stuck in that same epistemology of modern capitalist modernity that has produced these problems. So we need to have some boldness and be bold and say, yes, we need to talk about human destiny.
I think boldness is a correct word there. Intellectual courage is sometimes talked about. I think it connects to the issue we discussed on the first topic about the lack of addressing these issues that you discussed in the movements in India that you were involved in as somehow creating a lag. I think the centrality of these issues, like what it means to be human, the question of freedom, human ethics, in some sense they can appear, and often do appear for social movements in our time and in Europe in particular, as very abstract, as very disconnected from the movements, and in some sense that in an immediate sense that's true, in that, you know, if you are engaged in an explicit struggle or an explicit campaign at a particular time over certain issues, it's not directly relevant, or it doesn't directly aid you in gaining a particular victory or whatever it is. But I think the relevance comes in where concerning the basis of what it's actually for, that politics at the end of the day, as the organization of society, distribution of decision-making, whatever, is a means. And the question is towards what end? Towards humanity, society, human flourishing, whatever one wants to call it, but it's an active process for something. Do you disagree?
Yes and no, because I think that would be limiting the whole question, putting it in as a means and ends thing.
Well, that's fair enough. That's
and then,
true.
Of course, what are the ends? You get into normative discussions. And
That's
those
true,
normative discussions can become just arguments, you know. So it could become philosophical arguments without any practical political thing. The reason why these questions are important in politics and political change and political mobilization is twofold. One is we have, for want of a better word, let's call them, or a word that everybody will recognize, let's call them enemies. Yeah, whether they are transnational corporations or whether they are, whether they are states, authoritarian leaders, or whatever it is. And we need to struggle against them. We need to fight against Eurocentrism, racism. Yeah. But we also need, if we remain, and this is what modernist epistemology teaches you. You know, there is a thesis and there is an antithesis. There are the capitalists and there are the anti-capitalists. And that is true, because that's the reality. But the driving force of that anti-capitalist struggle or anti-racist struggle or whatever it is cannot be race or the desire for capital. Because that is what leads you into being exactly the same as your oppressors.
Yeah.
It has to come from another place.
Correct.
Yeah. But if you're going to abandon the politics and go to that other place and say, oh, we are all human, let's all hold hands, then you have lost the politics. Yeah. You know, you might become a Mahatma Gandhi or whatever, but you've lost the politics. So it has to come from that place, and it has to inform politics in a way that gives you the strength to fight for what is right, but at the same time, not for the things that you are against. You know, so not another capitalist society, not another racist society, not another thing. And that needs to come from somewhere. Yeah. And for me, the formative influence, in what got me thinking about this was again the Ghadar movement. Because throughout the Ghadar literature, if you look at it, they were one of the most, revolutionary fighters against the British Empire. They took the brunt of, the repression. But I've never read anyone say anything about we need to fight the British because they are white, or because they are Christians, or because they are English. They always maintain that we have nothing to, there is nothing. We need to fight the British because they are tyrants. We need to fight the British because they make promises and they don't keep them. So it had nothing to do with their color or their race or their religion. And the reason why this struck me is when you read the British literature on the Ghadar movement, they are always about, these are fanatical Sikhs. This has got to do with their Sikhism. This has got to do. And now when I look at things around us, everywhere you see, you talk about the Iraq struggle, or they say, oh, Shia Sunni, but Shias and Sunnis have lived for, they haven't come just after Saddam Hussein, or they've been there forever, but they were not always fighting with each other. But that frame, as if Iraq and the land and the people have nothing to do with this, whatever is going on. So, that way of framing. And what struck me is that it is important to hold on to that idea that we are against imperialism because it is oppressive, because it is unjust, because it is, it shackles us into, a state of semi-slave conditions. It is oppressive, it is tyrannical. And that is why we are against it. And I think this is very difficult to do within a modernist framework where you're pushed all the time. There is racism, and therefore there is the Black movement. There is this. And therefore, no, racism is bad because racism is oppressive. It is unfortunate that it has come from Europe, but it could have come from anywhere. Anyone can be a racist, no? So, and I think it is that, and that is where I think that keeping that philosophical, source of our resistance without compromising the politics of our resistance is so central to how we shape the politics.
Yes, I think you were very right. I very much agree with you that talking about it in terms of means and ends is not the right way to approach it. I think the way that you characterized it as being an issue of there being some outside place which can be a source, what you described as a driving force, gets at the issue, because in the one of the aspects of capitalist modernity is a tendency towards monopolization and towards the elimination of all outside or alternative. And in that sense, it's a totalitarian project that tries to construct a totality from which there's no outside. So I think the issue is to recognize that the purpose, in that sense, does not lie within that system, within that construct. So there needs to be a way for getting outside, to base oneself outside somehow from where that purpose, where that life force for resistance can flow from. So I think that's a good characterization.
There is another reason why it has to come from another place. The force or the energy, let's put it, the energy for political resistance has to come from another place, so that it doesn't become action and reaction.
Exactly.
Kind of phenomenon.
Yeah, absolutely.
As human beings, we are always an open book. And this is the extraordinary thing about being human, which was another issue that we talked about. So every human being has the capacity to distinguish between right and wrong, which is a basic sense that things, between what is good for community and people and what is not. Not that all people make the same decisions, but they have the capacity to do it. Yeah. Some people may make wrong decisions and we may not agree with them, or they may think that what we are saying is wrong, but we still have the capacity to make those decisions. So the capacity to judge, to evaluate, is a fundamental human attribute. And as long as that capacity remains, we must be able to convince everybody that, about what is right, what is fair, what enhances freedom and what does not. So, yes, we are against racism, but we must believe that there are many white people who are also against racism. So we don't become reductive. We must, of course, fight against imperialism, But we must also believe that within imperialist societies, there are many who also want human freedom. And that is why that human freedom, as the place and the source of that energy, it becomes very important in politics. Otherwise, you're going to have a very reductive kind of politics and not win over anybody.
Absolutely. The final thing I wanted to ask you about is you've spoken for the necessity of a kind of philosophical or intellectual renaissance. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are about how such a thing could come about.
Oh my God, I don't, I'm totally,
It's a small question to
absolutely
close it.
clueless. I have no idea.
Mm,
I have no idea other than a conviction that as long as I have breath in my body, I should keep on raving and ranting and raging. Beyond that, I have no idea where that will come. And which is why I continue to speak. I never say no to anybody who wants me to speak, because that's the only thing I can do. That's the only thing I can do. What else can I do? Beyond, as I said, ranting and raging.
Well, I appreciate you very much taking this opportunity to continue the ranting and raging. It was very much appreciated. Are there any last final thoughts you'd like to close with? Or?
No, thank you. And I hope there are more people who will rant and rage, and we can all, find or get somewhere or go some, I don't know. Yeah.
I share your hope. We need more ranters and ragers. It's true. All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure being on
The
this.
pleasure was mine, really. Thank you.